Today we're diving into an incredibly important topic for Australian expats, budgeting. But more importantly, the savings buckets we need to be thinking about and need to be utilising as expats living and working abroad. Hi there, Jarrad Brown here. If you're new to the channel, thank you for tuning in. I'm an Australian expat financial planner here in Singapore, helping Australians demystify the world of personal finance. Now, you may have heard of or seen this idea of savings buckets. If you've ever read The Barefoot Investor, you'll note that it's a very popular strategy that he recommends, dividing our savings into different buckets based on different goals. Now, as Australian expats, it's no different, but there are additional things we need to be thinking about. So here are the 5 buckets that as an Australian expat, you should be giving thought to as to whether they are appropriate for you to be setting money aside for. So number 1 is your repatriation bucket. Now, obviously, if you're an Australian resident, not one you need to think about, but as an Australian expat living, working in Singapore, chances are you're not going to live here forever. You're not going to retire here. One day you'll move back to Australia or somewhere else. And when we do, we're going to want to buy a car or pay down our mortgage or pay for school fees or pay for the flights or pay for shipping, bring our furniture home, whatever it may be. All of these things cost money. Now, if you're lucky enough that your company is going to cover those costs for you, then obviously you can factor that into how much you need in your repatriation bucket. But make sure you have that money set aside. Work out what that number needs to look like. Clearing tax. If you've got a deemed exercise tax on any unvested options shares when you leave, make sure we've got that money set aside. Once you hit that target, stop contributing. We don't need to be putting in extra funds into this bucket. It's lazy money, it's not really working for us, but we need it there. We also want to be very mindful of the currency that we hold those funds in. If you are an Australian expat and the majority of that money is to cover expenses in Australia, then hold it in Australian dollars. Don't take on currency risk that we can avoid and that we don't need to take on. So that's number 1. Number 2 is our emergency fund bucket. Now, this is one that whether you're an Australian resident or an expat, you need to have in place. It needs to be boring, it needs to be liquid, it needs not to be invested, and it needs to be readily accessible. So this is where we want to have 3 or 6 or 9 months of our expenses set aside in cash, in the currency for the country that we live in. So usually this is designed that if we lose our job, we have a health issue, something happens, we need access to funds quickly, this is what we dip into. So as an Australian expat in Singapore, my emergency fund is going to be in Singapore dollars because it's to cover my rent in Singapore dollars, my tax in Singapore dollars, my life in Singapore dollars. Again, avoid the currency risk if you can. If you're a sole breadwinner, you have children, push that up to 6 to 9 months. If you're running your own business and you're concerned that income is going to dry up, maybe you push it out to 12. But don't make that money difficult to get. And the other important point to note, it is not money for your holiday. It's not there for the ski trip or because there's a surprise birthday trip. It is there as an emergency fund. If you spend it, top it back up. That's number 2. Now, number 3 is your future home bucket. Now, this might be a property you already own in Australia that you're going to pay down the mortgage on when you return. It might be a property that you're going to buy when you return to Australia. We need to make sure that we're setting our target on how much we need to have there, whether it's going to be a deposit and we're going to borrow the remainder, whether we've got a mortgage to repay and we want to hit a certain amount of borrowing and that's going to be our ideal target. Whatever it may be, set that target and make sure we're setting funds aside. Don't ignore your currency risk. If it's a property in Australia, hold the fund in Australian dollars. If it's going to be spent in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we probably don't want to be putting that money at risk either. So don't go putting that into US shares because you think they only go up. Make sure it's accessible and we are considering the currency. But more importantly, where we see this one going wrong so many times is people get the blinders on and they think, great, once I hit my property target, then I'll think about everything else. And by that time, it's too late because you jump on realestate.com.au, not a plug by the way, but obviously where most Australians shop for property, and you see, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we spent 3 mil instead of 2, or 2 mil instead of 1, or 5 instead of 4.5. And that future home bucket just continues to grow. So make sure we're setting money aside for retirement and all the other buckets as well as the future home at the same time. That brings us on to bucket number 4, and that is our education bucket. Now this might be for university or college fees, it might be for high school, it might be for secondary school. Usually we want to have different buckets for each of those education timeframes, depending on how many years before those expenses are incurred. Again, we need to be mindful of currency risk. Where might your child study? Is that going to be back in Australia? Is it in the US? Do you have no idea? If you have no idea, then diversify those funds. We also want to be very mindful of the tax implications. Are we going to withdraw that money in our own name? Is it going to be in our child's name? Will we be in Australia at the time? Do we want to take out HECS or a student loan? What are we going to do? We need to make sure we are setting that money aside and it is there, readily accessible when we need it. And of course, the 5th and final bucket for Australian expats is for our retirement. Now, this is where we need to be setting money aside. Make sure you're at least contributing more than your employer would contribute to your super. Otherwise, what's the point of being in Singapore? Of course, there are many other benefits of life here, but if we're not at least replacing what we would have earned in super to cover our opportunity cost with our retirement, then we really need to readdress our budget. So make sure we're setting that money aside, make sure it's invested, it's growing for us, it's well diversified, we're not ignoring the currency risk, and of course, don't ignore the tax implications either. So there you have it, the 5 buckets when it comes to Australian expat saving and budgeting and how you can set your money aside. I hope that helps. Drop me a note with any comments or questions. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next one.